Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series, and in today's conversation, we're continuing our discussion on the generations, and specifically how different generations are unique, how they are the same, and specifically, how can marketing and communications professionals tailor messaging? What should business leaders consider when addressing these vastly different groups of customers, employees, and stakeholders?
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Joining me today is Ivan Pollard, the leader of the Marketing Communications Center here at the Conference Board. Ivan, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
So, Ivan, we've just done this series of recordings on the generations with a representative from each generation, from the silent generation all the way down to Generation Alpha, which are even the newborns today are Generation Alpha. So it's been great fun doing them, but you've had a chance to listen into all of them, and as well, you're a marketing expert, former CMO, and all of that. So you've been dealing with these issues for a very long time. But talk about talk about your reaction to the recordings of the various generations.
Well, first and foremost, it was really very uplifting to listen to the string that connects the time that goes across all of those people. They were different people from different generations of different ages, and yet to hear them talk about the same sorts of things but in different ways was really very illuminating.
They're all humans, huh?
Apparently so.
And there's some connection with all those humans regardless of which generation.
Without a doubt. And, the illumination that those podcasts brought just in 30 minutes, to just hear what the experiences were like for these people growing up, what was the same and what was different. It was very useful.
Okay, so, just some highlights on what was the same and what was different.
Well, I think the things that were the same that struck me, as you said already, everybody's a human. Their experiences are going to shape the way they process information and they think and they talk and what their aspirations and their desires are, and across the arc of time. So the thing that I thought was interesting, though, was that you could kind of picture that the older folks had already lived through the generations of the younger folks. So even Evelyn, the Gen Alpha, 10 years old, born in 2012, she was talking about things that Frank had talked about as one of the silent generation, but in a slightly different way. So this notion that our human experience, the arc of your life and the connections you make and the things that are important to you, it was very interesting how similar those were. I don't know how you felt about it, Steve, but...
Yeah, that was a surprise to me, too, listening to it, that there were a lot of similarities. But there were some differences, too. And the question first of all, what were the differences? But then the question is, were they differences because of the uniqueness of the individual, or where they lived and born, or what they had experienced? What do you think?
Well, I think three things stood out to me that when you got to listen to them back to back, so you got that thread that was joining them across, almost 100 years. There were three things that stood out to me. The first was very obvious, which was their interaction with the media, with where they got information, where they got influence, where they got education. That thing definitely changed over the arc of time, from trusting the local newspaper to deciding that, you should be the voice of your generation on TikTok. That was one thing that I thought was different.
Yeah. And we do, by the way, recommend that everybody listen to these 6 individuals who were representatives of their generation and just listen to their stories. We tried to ask very similar questions so that we could get their reactions, and it's just fascinating. So what were some of the surprises to you, from any of the conversations?
Yeah, I think there were 2 other differences that struck me. One was the evolving attitude to work. As you went from generation to generation to generation, jobs were still important, but the role that they played in the definition of the individual and their belief about what their life was amounting to, that subtly changed as you went through from the silent generation to baby boomers to Gen X and all the way to Alpha. You could hear how they were talking about work in just a slightly different tone, is the way I would put it.
Yeah, would you say that maybe the older generations kind of work to live and the newer ones live to work?
I think...
Maybe it's the other way around?
I actually think they both work to live and they both live to work.
Interesting.
I think,
so say more on that.
Well, I think there's a little bit about the economic situation that people were in and the need to be able to raise money, and how that has changed over time. So the context in which the revenue generation part of a job was important has changed. I do still think that even you go back and you listen to the baby boomers, you listen to Chuck, and what he was doing with his working life was not that different from what the millennial Alex was talking about and what she wants from work. It just came in a slightly different balance of tones, if you like. So I thought that was changing.
But it does say, I think the people who, need to work because they need to eat in each generation probably are more similar. But maybe were we witnessing maybe just wealth creation, wealthier generations as time went on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as you and I have discussed before, the baby boomers, perhaps the wealthiest generation we have ever seen and may ever see. So, the creation, their attitude and ethic for work and the creation of value and wealth around the world. And you just look across these generations, how the world has actually got better. Less people in poverty, more people with access to education and medicine. It's a truth that you can go read a book. There are books about it that you will study. So I do think that there are less people in that situation than before. So it was a less common experience about I have to have a job. I do think there's also more choice because we're also more educated these days and there are more opportunities. And so I think some of the things you hear about Gen Z and the millennials and their approach to work are kind of things that were said about me when I came out of college and my approach to work. Was I going to work as hard as my granddad? Did I need money as much as my granddad?
Wanted more flexibility.
Was I willing? I wanted more flexibility.
Wanted some balance.
Yeah. I want to enjoy my life. I don't want to, I'll find a job I love because then I'll never have to work again, those sorts of things. So we were brought up with that, and I think Gen Z are representing that too. Another thing that I thought subtly changed was that notion of flexibility and freedom, what freedom means to people, and the scope of that freedom, what the world means to people. So when you listen to the millennials and the Gen Zs, their concept of liberty was perhaps a little different than what the silent generation and the baby boomers' concept of liberty was, what I could achieve.
Yeah, and this notion of education, which you touched on, is an interesting one, because I think if you reflect on the conversation from the silent generation about the greatest generation, so their parents, the greatest generation kind of took education as, if you can do it, fine, but many of them dropped out in the 6th grade or the 3rd grade, or if they were on a farm, they didn't go at all. And there were colleges, of course, but for very, very few. And I think today it's been more democratized, and we kind of heard that throughout the generations.
Without doubt. I mean, it was really kind of humbling to listen to Frank talk about the silent generation and what education, the optimism that he voiced and the opportunity to get educated. And then you go all the way forward and it's almost like taken for granted, almost to the extent that we're starting to go down the other side, that maybe education's not as important as we thought it was, and is it worth the money that it's giving? If you're Gen Z right now, you are questioning, does college pay back? It's
interesting because you're seeing more males in Gen Z sort of drop out and not do post-high school work. Yeah, well, that's very interesting. The other thing is we didn't get into this specifically, but the social safety net has changed dramatically, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on how much that just takes sort of the the worry out of life, because if you listen to the older generation, it says I had to go, I had to get to work, I had to get a job because I had to eat, I had to feed my family. Whereas now it's like, well, and so, but there are big safety nets. So I wonder, and we've done this deliberately as a society, I wonder if that gives more freedom.
I think it does, and maybe that's one of the benefits of the safety net and the entire infrastructure of modern democracies and governments, that's the way that we are wanting to bring entrepreneurialism, creativity, freedom, liberty. Maybe that brings it up, but early on, that notion that it was kind of almost, I'm going to put it a bit bluntly, but do or die. You had to get out there and you had to contribute and you had to make the money. And then you heard it subtly shift, in the baby boomers when Chuck was talking. It was super interesting to hear him talk about opening up the possibilities and yet still having that worry about security. And now you look at, security doesn't come up as an issue for Gen Z. This point that you made about baby boomers being the richest generation ever, and this is globally. There are differences globally, but it is globally. And they're now saying that the millennials will be the greatest beneficiaries of that wealth. And so for the first time, you have a whole generation that I guess are like heirs. I don't know. Well, I think... we'll talk to Prince Harry about being there and see how he feels about that. But there's a...
We're not going to talk to Prince Harry, just for the record.
Well, yes. Sorry, Prince Harry. We'll take that back. I do think there is this kind of this sensibility amongst some of the generations that's with this freedom comes a lack of responsibility because of this safety net, either provided by the infrastructure of government or provided by their mum and dad and what they're going to inherit.
Right, but the younger generations, it's they're not saying I've got to get a job. They're not talking about jobs anymore. They're talking about I have the I might do this with my life. I might do this, which is it's ability to dream.
And I think that's a lovely thing. I think we've given them the ability to dream, and as a result of that, I think we're getting one of the most creative, entrepreneurial, collaborative, connected communities where the differences are less and the possibilities are more.
Connected, collaborative, creative.
Something else beginning with C.
You've got a lot of C's in there.
Yeah.
So any other profound moments for you from this?
I think listening to and we'll talk a little about this when we get into marketing, but listening to the events that shaped the way these people think. I thought that was, whether it was, landing a man on the moon, or whether it was the invention of the internet, whether it was 9/11, whether it was COVID, we have to acknowledge there are shared events. That's the thing, shared events that create a connective tissue between all of these people in a generation that can be something that marketers can tap into.
Yeah, and then there's this thread of technology that ran through them. Talk about that. Yeah,
you look at... I think we over-exaggerate this notion that generations are inept at some technologies. You can get the facts and out there. Baby boomers, 85% of them have got a cell phone. Gen X, 90%. Gen Z, 95%. The thing that's fascinating, baby boomers spend more time on the screen than millennials do, because they've got more time on their hands maybe, but they're actually adapters of technology. The speed with which they adapt to it is the thing that differs. But you think there are critical technology for a baby boomer was the telephone and the television. Critical technology for the millennial was the cell phone and the laptop computer. Go forward, Gen Z, now we're going smartphones and gaming consoles, actually, which was a little unique. And the next generation, what's it going to be? Is it going to be AI? Is it going to be VR, virtual reality, augmented reality, quantum computing,
the metaverse,
technology?
Yeah, all of these things. And and technology is played. You think of technology as being something that just happened, but it's this is the broad definition of technology takes you way back, and it changed even the agrarian way of life through technological breakthroughs, and obviously the telephone and electricity and all of these other things that have enabled all the technology that has come since, but it changed every generation in some fashion. I maybe back to the Stone Age. I don't know. We didn't go back that far.
You didn't. I would be impressed if you could interview somebody from the Stone Age, and knowing you probably could. So this idea that technology, it's a very ancient Greek word, and it goes all the way back then. And the application of technology to solve problems is what humans have been great at. I think the thing that we can see even across the podcast is the speed with which new technology transforms the experiences of the generation.
And is adapted not just by that newest generation, but as you're saying, back up through the previous generations.
Yeah, grandmas do FaceTime from France and talk to my grandchildren in Minnesota. Yeah. And sure, sometimes you have to tell her how to log on, but most of the time she can do it herself.
We've discussed the characteristics of different generations and some of the uniquenesses, some of the similarities and differences. Next, we'll explore the impact on these differences on marketing communications. We're going to take a short break. Be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Ivan Pollard, the leader of our Marketing Communications Center. Okay, so Ivan, we're talking about these, the podcasts that deal with the various generations and, the individuals who have represented that. Now, there is a huge implication for marketing communications in this because you have all of these generations now living at one time. They're all consumers of one sort or another. So if, as a marketing and communications expert, how do you sort all this?
Well, I think it's a super good question. To start off with a kind of a basic truth, if you're a marketer, you're going to look to exploit all of the differences between the groups so that you can target. But you're also going to be looking to exploit all the similarities so that you can be more efficient. So the one thing that I think I have a slight problem with these labels of, these are tens of millions of people who are in the millennials or Gen Z or the baby boomers. Tens of millions of them, and that begs the question about whether mass marketing still has a role to play. And I think it does. I think we have, through the digital age, because of this possibility to connect personally, I do think that we've forgotten that sometimes you can sell a product or an idea or a belief to tens of millions of people. And when you're dealing at that level, I do think then these labels are pretty good. Having said that, they're not as good as life stages. So,
well, you've talked before about it being a target. Think of it as an archery target with a bullseye in the center and outer rings, and the generations being maybe in various places on that target. Is that an apt metaphor?
I think it was maybe 30 years ago when we didn't have the possibility to address an individual with a personalized message with an economic component to it that made it worthwhile doing. So I still think it is important that you can think about targets. I think where we slightly strayed off the straight and narrow as a media guy was we thought that digital would cut out wastage, that target, all I ever wanted was to reach the bullseye. For some people, that may be true. There may be some businesses where you know exactly the moment in time and the person to whom you need to sell, and to advertise or market to anybody else is a waste of your time. For most businesses, though, those people in the target are the ones that you want worth most to you. Well, the next group are not worthless; they're just worth less.
Yeah, but and you need some of them. But you made you're making an interesting point, because if you think about it more on the B2B side, where there are specific things that you're selling or a service that you're selling, or if you're selling a plane, you don't want mass marketing for that. But if you're still in the B2C business and you're trying to reach more than one demographic, there may be a bullseye, but you also want the collateral generations to participate too.
Yeah. So I used to work for a company that sold soda for a living that was focused entirely on teenagers. And yet I know a lot of people, some of them sitting in this room, who quite happily drink Diet Coca-Cola or the original Coca-Cola. And if you get too targeted, you start to disappear from the fabric of society. And if you're a brand that big, I think that's going to cost you. The other thing I think that's happened when you talk about the technology, Steve, over time, is we used to deal in opportunities to see, for instance, if you were constructing an advertising campaign, for instance, or your response level on your direct mail campaigns. And it was all about contact. I do think now the whole paradigm of marketing it's not shifted, but it's more executable to connect rather than just contact. So customer service used to connect when I was a young boy growing up and wanting to return my training shoes because they fell apart. I could connect. Nowadays you could do that, and especially with the application now of AI and content, generative AI, and some of the things it can do for content, you can create real connections with people, especially when Gen Z is spending half the day on the telephone, for instance. So those connections, I think, can be leveraged, but it doesn't rule out the need for a brand, though.
But still, the generations do play a role. I mean, if you're trying to use borrowed equity, for example, you use. I'm just thinking about pop groups or whatever. You don't use current musicians or current singers in order to hit the silent generation and vice versa. So there is something in marketing communications that you have to be relevant and break through to what's kind of familiar to them.
Yeah, and so building off the basis of what connects them. So I do think this is where, to go backwards then, these life stages and these labels, these generational things, they do tell you the things that have affected the way they think and feel. And you've got to remember, the older you are, the more ingrained your behaviours, so the harder it is to change. There are brands you love and brands you've never heard of, so there's opportunities to switch or new news. And there's also influences on you that you can tap into. So, you show me a video of Pele reconstituted in real life, bless his soul, he's passed on now, but you could use generative AI to have him advertise to me personally, which pop I need to drink tonight.
Yeah, so that's part of it. You made another comment earlier that I want to come back to, and that is that the generations are more similar at the same life stage than they are different. Talk about that, because that's something that was a hypothesis going into this.
Yeah, and I think you can literally, I would urge you to do what Steve said, just listen to some, just excerpts even of the 6 podcasts, and you will hear common themes repeated where you could almost pick it up and put it in the voice of one of the other podcasters and go, here's a 10-year-old talking like a baby boomer did in 1970. If that baby boomer was Prince Charles, for instance, we have a 10-year-old girl in Europe saying, hey, you baby boomers, climate change. You mess this up and you're going to leave it to us to fix it.
And yet it was the baby boomers who established Earth Day and the very first standards and marched and all that. So it is. So a lot of the behaviors, as you said, that we ascribe to this current generation, whatever that is, Gen Z or millennials, are the same things that were said about us in the beginning of our careers, and same thing. So there is a lot of similarity here just because of the age, and people do. There are differences, of course, and that's, as you say, impacted by events around you, the times, the technology, and changing societal norms, all of that. Fair?
Fair, very fair. And you touch on a really brilliant point, Steve, which is there are those you remember I said exploit the similarities. So here we are, baby boomers, sitting in the studio with brilliant technology, capturing a podcast that people will listen to on their smartphones when they want to. And yet inside both of us is that young 10-year-old kid that, sure, we collected baseball cards, but we also cared that the tiger was going to go extinct before our kids grew up. And that's exactly what the Gen Alpha kid was saying. Hey, inside you is me. And you could touch that nerve again. And you mentioned pop music. It may be a different singer, but it was still pop music, and what it felt like to sing at the top of your lungs as you're riding your bike down the street at 4 a.m, waking up all the neighbours. There are behaviours that we have already done that this group today are doing, and some great marketing comes when you tap into those fundamental shared experiences.
We're talking about marketing, and that has one target group, theoretically customers, but we live in a multi-stakeholder world: customers, employees, owners, environment. And so the marketing and communications elements not only need to be thinking about your customer, but need to be thinking about this broad consumer of your communication, and all of those across multiple generations. How does a marketer or a chief communications officer, how should she balance all of that?
So I think this has been one of the evolutions of the way marketers and communicators need to think. We used to think about message from, sent to target audience. Now it's a much more shared kind of network, a neural network of interconnected messaging that you no longer control, but you can catalyze and you can focus. And I think you have to acknowledge, if you're not thinking about all of your stakeholders when you create any single piece of marketing and thinking about how they're going to respond, you're not doing your job.
Well, this is an example with Bud Light, who was trying to communicate to one demographic, but it wasn't thinking about the impact on other constituents in this. Right, and I'm not trying to say one was right and one was wrong, but it was just there was the unintended consequences.
Yeah. And those unintended consequences, we all have to plan for those. That's why we need to think about all the time. Insights for what's ahead is critical, and the what if scenarios and what the heck scenarios, those things you've got to plan for. And we shouldn't pick on Bud Light. We've all done it. I've done it in some of the things that I've stood behind.
But again, it was a blind spot on the generations and this multi-constituency. And so you have to be thinking about every part of it.
And don't think that just because you did that particular influencer just in this particular digital channel, that it's not going to get picked up and shared. That's the big difference for a marketer these days. Nothing is controlled.
Well, I remember when I was marketing Quaker Oats, and the demographic skewed 55 plus, and we said, oh, this is terrible, we're going to lose this market because, don't you know, those people are going to die and it's going to go away. We've got to appeal to the young generation. And the mistake in that is that there will always be 55 plus people, and so it's a matter of trying to understand your market and understand the generational piece of this and so forth.
And the dynamics of it, Steve, like you point out. My father once said to me, don't worry, boy, there are always fresh consumers in the marketplace.
Yeah, and in various places. So, okay, final point, what remaining advice do you have to marketing communication professionals as they try to communicate and motivate and market to each of these groups?
So I think never give up the fundamentals of marketing. Those principles remain the same. Who are you talking to? What's important? What's relevant, as you said, but what's different and valuable about what it is that you have to say to that group? So you need empathy with the people and the situation they're in, and you need an understanding not just of the moment in time, but of all of the experiences that have crafted the way their beliefs and their behaviours can get affected by you. So they're the principles. They stay the same. The practices, if you're not right up on the leading edge, you're going to get beaten. So think about how you can apply all of that lovely knowledge that you've got about the insight to the consumer group and the magic of your brand and its valuable difference in the marketplace, but apply it through the things that are the most effective and the most efficient to get you the biggest return on your money. Remember, marketing is about driving growth for a business, and it's about doing that profitably.
And when in doubt, call Ivan Pollard at the conference for some great advice.
If you'd like, I'm always open so long as you are a member.
Ivan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in economics, geopolitics, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with every generation you know. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.